Now, if you've been involved in Christianity at all for the past 2 decades, you probably know what the initials WWJD stand for, right? Right? Anybody, not really familiar with that? You could find that thing on bracelets, on T-shirts, on coffee mugs, on bumper stickers. You could find it all over the place. What would Jesus do? Now, it was kind of started as actually, I think it happened in a youth rally. It was actually first coined in a book called In His Steps, which came out in the previous century. But a guy began to think, what would Jesus do? And so some Christians groups got a hold of that message in the early 90s and began to really kind of promote this as a real big thing. How many of you had What Would Jesus Do bracelets? Anybody? Anybody still wearing one? Yeah, see, it's not stylish anymore, is it? It's just one of those things. They were replaced by yellow ones, right? That's what happened, Live strong. But, it's one of those things. It was this kind of fad that hit the what would Jesus do? And my favorite were the bumper stickers. Honestly, there was like a little window decal. Did anybody ever see the window decal? Yeah, I want to give kudos to anybody who's willing to put that on their car, because every time a cop stops them, he has to walk up and say, well, he wouldn't have done that, But Jesus would buy AAA, just so you know. All right, that's according to that. What would Jesus do? It was a popular theme, and honestly, there was a challenge involved in that I think is positive. That we begin to think through what would Jesus do in this circumstance. But honestly, as with a lot of things that start out as a really positive and good thing, they can have a dark side to them. And the What Would Jesus Do movement kind of had that same dark side. Because many people don't look at what would Jesus do as far as what would Jesus do in a positive way. It almost becomes a what wouldn't Jesus do. Like if I'm wearing that bracelet, well, then I can't do this. Yeah, and some of you were resistant to even put on a bracelet that said, what would Jesus do? Because you knew that there were patterns in your life that weren't consistent with the bracelet on your wrist. And you might not say that. You might say, well, it's a style thing. But in your heart of hearts, I don't necessarily want to proclaim this too loudly. I don't want too many people expecting me to be Jesus, because that's kind of a high mark. And so your program is this ALINH. At least I'm not Hitler. That would be an easier one, or maybe if you consider yourself a little better than that, you might take up the other cause that we're looking at, which would be IKTTDWJWD. I kind of tried to do what Jesus would do. Because isn't Jesus just kind of a high mark to try to live up to? Honestly, it was like, we would be much more comfortable with something that said, I did better than that guy. Or I did better than my boss, or something like that. We want a comparison that we can actually live up to and beyond. You throw Jesus in the mix, and suddenly that just becomes just too high of a watermark. None of us are going to be exactly like Jesus. And so we kind of look at that, and honestly, I think that's part of why the fad kind of floated away. It's because everybody knows that that's a mark that's just a little bit too high to try to reach. But why do we have such an opinion like that? What is it about the character of Jesus that challenges us so much? Honestly, if I told you today that I'm going to make you leave and you have to wear a hat, a t-shirt, a bracelet, and you have to drive a car that proclaims that you're a Christian and that you're a Christ follower and you're trying to be like Jesus, is there any part of you that would go, I'm not, beyond the style thing and being told what to do, which we don't like, there's this other side of us that says, I don't want to go around all the time having to wear that identity. That curbs a lot of behavior that I like. That challenges a lot of mindsets and opinions that I have. If suddenly I have to be like Jesus. But wait, indulge me for a second. Because I heard this song, the song that the worship team just sang. I heard that a few months ago, and as I was listening to it, it just resonated with me. That question, well, I have enough trouble trying to be like Jesus. What if I was Jesus? I mean, what if in my life, in my context, not some Bible time 2,000 years ago, what happens if in 2009 I was Jesus? Ask yourself that question. What if you were Jesus? What would you do? What would you do with all that power? What would you do with all that wisdom and knowledge, all that authority, all that ability to look into the hearts and the lives of the people around you? The creative power that Jesus had to turn water into wine, to turn a little lunch into a feast for thousands. The ability to raise the dead and to heal the sick. What would you do if you were Jesus? Think about that for a second. That is it's an uncomfortable thought. Because if you go down the trail of if I was Jesus and I had all those abilities, pretty soon you're looking at a life that isn't yours anymore. Because the moment you heal somebody, guess what's going to form outside your door? A long line of people without health care. As soon as you start making food from one small lunch, those crowds aren't going to stop. And with mass transportation, the whole nation's going to be at your door. What if you were Jesus? What would that look like in your context? And as I was thinking about that, the one thing that I kept coming back to is, well, at least I'm not. There is a little bit of that, thank goodness Jesus is Jesus and I'm not. That would be bad for everybody. And so there's a part of me that says that. But there's another part of me that comes along and says, but what does Jesus have to say about who I am? Because Jesus has something a little bit different for us when he was talking to his disciples one time. And Jesus comes down to a different conclusion than many of us would assume. Because in Jesus' mindset, in the way he taught, in the way that the followers of Jesus taught in the New Testament, there is an expectation that Jesus has of us. And it's this: Jesus expects us to be him. Jesus expects us to be him. Now, before you stone me as a heretic, all right? I'm not getting New Age on you and how all of us become our own gods or, find the Jesus in you kind of a thing. That's not where we're going. But Jesus is very clear that he expects us to be him in this world. Now, we're not going to be him as far as the Trinity, because last time I checked, there are no vacancies in the Trinity, all right? God doesn't need us to be him in that sense. Now, there was a guy that wrote a book called The Three Christs of Ypsilanti, and I'm going to butcher his name. He's a psychologist, Milton Rokeach. And he worked in a mental facility in Ypsilanti. And this facility was very unique in that there were three guys, a guy named Leon, Joseph, and Clyde. All three of them thought they were Jesus Christ. Each one had a full delusion that they were Jesus Christ on earth. And he was trying to work with them, and after a couple of years of trying to help them through this delusion, he couldn't get them to come to a sensible idea of who they were. And so he began to think, what can I do to help force them out of this delusion? And he had an idea. I know what I'll do. I'll put them together. Because there can't be three Christs in one room like that, And so he's like, this is what I'm going to do. And so they ate meals together. They worked together. They slept in the same area. And they worked. They had small group time together. They were constantly around each other. And yet all three of them claimed to be Christ. And after years of doing this, the psychologist was still frustrated. Because one day, one of the guys said, I am the Messiah, the Son of God. I am on a mission. I was sent here to save the earth. How do you know? The psychologist said. God told me, was the reply. To which another of the three men countered, I never told you any such thing.